Another consideration is your camera settings. They are extremely important in double exposure photography. It's important to understand the ins and outs of how to set your camera before you start shooting a double exposure photograph. Okay, so you're looking at the back of my Canon 5D Mark III. The first thing I do whenever I am getting ready for a double exposure photograph is, obviously I turn it on, but then I'm pushing the style button. The style button is right here. It looks like a paintbrush and canvas. Whenever I do that, you'll see three different options. You have picture style, multiple exposure, and HDR. We're going to be in multiple exposure, obviously. I'm going to go ahead and choose it. Some options here. The first one is I have to enable it. I just choose on function control, multiple exposure control. Now, the options we have are additive, average, bright, and dark. I always choose additive. Why? This allows me to composite two or more images in the function and form of film photography. That's the look that I'm going for and I like, so that's what I'm going to do. I do challenge you to try some of those other ones as you experiment with double exposure photography. Number of exposures, you can choose 2 or more. I almost always am just choosing 2, but feel free to experiment with that as well. Save image sources. You can tell your 5D Mark III to save all of the images, your texture image, your portrait image, and your final composite, or just the result only. I like doing all images just because I like to show you guys my before and afters. You can also choose continual multiple exposure or one shot. Again, experiment with that just to see what you like and how your workflow is. Now, the final one, after I have all my settings set up, is select image for multiple exposure. Now, I only do this, at least my workflow, I only choose select image for multiple exposure after I've shot my original portrait. Now I'll show you my portrait that I shot beforehand. It's right here. So I have my highlight enabled to show you where blown out parts of the image are around the portrait. That looks nice. That's what I want because that's the part of the image I want to fill. Okay. So that's the image I took before I began the composite part of my multiple exposure or double exposure photograph. Now, let me go back into multiple exposure mode. I'm already on because I haven't shot another photograph outside of multiple exposure. So all I have to do is go straight down to select image for multiple exposure. And now what I'm going to do is the first image that pops up is that image. That's the image that I want to use. And it's asking me to set the image. I go ahead and press OK. And then it goes back to my multiple exposure window. Now what happens next is I go into live view mode. The way that I go into live view mode in my 5D Mark III is the start stop button. When I do that, the back of the camera shows me a ghost image of the portrait that I took. This is why I love shooting with the 5D Mark III. I can move my focus area over top of the face where I want my audience's attention to be drawn, and then I walk around and I shoot that image over and over again until I get my final look. I can always go back to that portrait at any time and choose it again and try it as many times as I want to in the 5D Mark III. If I go ahead and shoot right now, you'll see the background there, those cabinets, filled that area. Now, some other things. As far as the camera settings go for the portrait comparatively to the background texture, let me go over that. So, I went ahead and shot a double exposure photograph to show you guys the settings ahead of time. Now, this is one that I shot, and notice the settings. It says 1/100th of a second at f-stop 13. Okay, that is not what every image in this composite was shot at. Let me show you what every image was shot at here. Now, what the multiple exposure composite took on was the previous image, the textured image settings. 1/100th at f-stop 13. Okay, now let me show you the portrait setting. The portrait setting was at 1/800th of a second at f-stop 2.5. Okay, so I intentionally tried to get more of a blurred background and specifically focus on her with the portrait. And then when I switch over to my textured background, you see that I want more of it in focus. Here's another one that I did. Again, it took on the 1/400th of a second at 3.5. Now this was a very different one I did. So the textured shot was just a little bit above what I normally do portraits at f-stop 3.5. And this is me experimenting. And again, I used the same portrait. So that's one example of a double exposure using that multiple exposure mode on the 5D Mark III. And here's another example of a double exposure using the multiple exposure mode on the 5D Mark III. Now, if I press my info button, you can see the histogram as well. You can see our color. You can see my ISO is at 100. You can check out your red, green, blues. And you can also see that it was shot in RAW. That's one thing that I love about the 5D Mark III. It creates a beautiful RAW file for me to be able to manipulate in Lightroom and Photoshop if I choose to do so.